So, my name's Sean Smith, and I want to thank you for coming out tonight to hear my book reading and learn about my passion for writing books in national parks. So, we're going to spend a little bit of time together, and like I said, I really do appreciate you coming out. So, what we're going to do tonight, I want to talk about a couple things. Why do I write thrillers? What is my current book about? And maybe what's next, and where I get my inspiration for some of these books. How does that sound?
That's good.
Okay? All right. Well, if you have questions at any time throughout, feel free to ask me. So, and I'll tell a few stories about my experience working for the Park Service too. So, why do I write thrillers? So, as I was telling Chris, right? So, about 5 or 6 years ago, I was kind of thinking about my career, what I want to do. And I got a life coach. And he said, well, you know, if you could do anything, what would you do? And I said, well, I've got this idea for a book that I'd like to write. And he said, well, what's stopping you? What's keeping you from writing? Well, I'd never written anything before in my life, and kind of growing up in school, I really wasn't that good a writer. So I was like, well, that's kind of what's stopping me from writing books. And he's like, well, let's just see what we can do. So he just said, let's get started. And I had this idea for a book that I had first thought about when I was a park ranger in Yellowstone. And he said, let's just see what happens. So as I was telling Chris about, I set aside a little bit of time. At this time I was traveling, I had a daily commute to Seattle. So I took the train, and every day on the train I would write for 40 minutes in the morning and 40 minutes on the way home. And that led to my first book, which is Unleashing Coulter's Hell there. So it's a little bit hard to see. But let me back up a little bit. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So when I was growing up, my parents took us every summer to Glacier National Park in Montana. And we grew up in Spokane, and that was kind of my parents' family vacation, and they wanted to go there. And the idea of national parks slowly kind of just was, I just kind of seeped into my DNA, and I really liked the idea of national parks. And in 1992, I got to be a park ranger in Glacier Park. And then after that, I was a park ranger at Mount St. Helens. And then I also was in the North Cascades, and finally finished up in Yellowstone National Park. And it was a great 5 years. Most of it was seasonal work. So it was you're great in the summertime, but you starve in the wintertime. So you have to find things to do in the winter. And in fact, I tell the joke, you know, why did you stop being a park ranger? And part of the reason was that my parents changed the locks on their basement. So I had to get a real job, and eventually landed a job in San Francisco. So it was a big change for me. But I never lost my love of the national parks and being a park ranger. And when I lived in the parks, as I said, I was in some of the most remote places. And this was back in the late 90s. So it was just the beginning of the internet. We didn't have cell phones. And so in the evening, when you're back in your trailer, you're pretty much by yourself. We didn't have TV. I got one radio station out of Jackson Hole. You had to find things to do. And so I would read a lot of books. And so I've always been interested in books like thrillers and adventures, things like this. I like Tom Clancy. I like Dan Brown. But I really like the 007 series. I introduced myself at the beginning. My name is Sean Smith. My dad named me after Sean Connery. So you could say there's a little bit of the thriller DNA in my DNA, actually. So, you know, you do those, you read those, and that's how I kind of spent my time. And so in, like I said, about 2011, my life coach was saying, well, why don't you write a book? And I said, you know, I've got this idea, and I've been working in the national parks, and I was at a theater one time. So I worked in Yellowstone, where we would go on the weekends is Jackson Hole to go shopping for our groceries, and I'd do my laundry, and you'd make a day of it, and that's about 60 miles away. So while I'm doing that, I said, well, let's go to the movie. So I think there was a James Bond movie coming out at that time, so I went to see it, and I was watching the movie, and I'm a park ranger, and as James Bond is rappelling off a cliff, I'm like, I've done that. And James Bond is driving fast cars. Well, as a park ranger, we sometimes have to pursue people. I've done that. And I went to the Law Enforcement Academy, and I've shot rifles and pistols. I'm like, I've even flown a plane. So all of the things that James Bond was doing, short of chasing terrorists through, Berlin, I had done as a park ranger. And so I was like, wow, I wonder why there aren't some thriller-based books in settings that Americans or people that live in the United States would be familiar with, because that's part of the intrigue of those books as you put yourself in those books and those settings. And I was like, this would make a great idea for a story. So, like I said, with my life coach, we decided to get started and write a book, and that eventually led to my first book called Unleashing Culture's Hell. One of the things that people ask, well, what motivates you to write these books? And so, horror movies and things like that where they have ghosts or zombies, that really doesn't scare me or really get my juices flowing. What does, having worked in national parks, are things like, and it's hard to see here, but that's, say, a meteor strike there, that's tough to see. Extinction events get me going. Having worked at Yellowstone, the world's largest supervolcano, which every 300,000 years has a dramatic eruption. And it's been about 400,000 years since the last eruption in Yellowstone. So it's overdue. And so when I was in Yellowstone, I was thinking one day, I was walking and saying, I wonder what would happen if Yellowstone were to erupt. And then I was like, well, wow, I wonder if someone could get this volcano to erupt. And so that was the inkling of the start of my first book. Other things that I'm interested in or worried about are Civil War. And that was the genesis of my second book, which is called Lost Cause. And then my third book, which is the one we're looking at right now, is called Need to Know, and that's about invasion or mysteries or secrets that the government holds. So we're going to talk a little bit about that one at the end here. So I said my first book was called Unleashing Culture's Hell. It was written in 2012, and it's about a terrorist plot to ignite the Yellowstone supervolcano and cause an eruption that could devastate the United States. One of the things I lived through 9/11, like all of you, and I wondered at times that the terrorist attacks that take place, they must at times get frustrated that their efforts really don't have any lasting effect. And I was wondering, and when I wrote this book, where might there be America's Achilles heel? Where could you do damage that could significantly impact the United States? And Yellowstone, actually, I thought would be that place. Yellowstone is, as I said, the world's largest supervolcano. And if it were to erupt, and this is hard to see, but this is a map of the United States, and Yellowstone is in here. And this is the impact area of where the volcano would have devastating impacts upon the United States. And this is all the way out to Florida. It's really hard to see. But if Yellowstone were to erupt, it would make Mount St. Helens look like it was absolutely nothing. You would see tens of feet of ash throughout Wyoming. You would see clouds of dust and materials for weeks on end that could change the climate of the world. The United States would be in very difficult shape if that were to happen. Now, it's funny, my wife one time asked, don't you worry sometimes about thinking about these and putting these ideas out there? And I said, well, to be totally honest, not that many people have read my books. So I think the chances of that are pretty slim. And then that said, there also are some things that would have to happen in order for that actually to take place. And in fact, I've seen some articles since then, which I will assume was due to my book saying that a nuclear device could not trigger Yellowstone, but it's still something I like to think about. So my next book was called Lost Cause. So while you're writing, at times it triggers other ideas. You start to think about, people have asked me about their writing experience and how that worked. I had my first idea, but I didn't have the next one. And as I'm writing, you kind of get these ideas and you're like, well, what would my next book be? What would I like to write my next book about? And this was in 2014. And this book is about what could happen or what could possibly start the second Civil War in the United States. I've lived a fair amount of time in the South, and the Civil War is still something that is on the front burner in many of those communities. And so I was thinking, I wonder if there was something that could cause people to start a second Civil War, and what would that be? And that book is about a lost artifact that was found in Gettysburg that possibly holds the power of Robert E. Lee to help start a second Civil War. And what's interesting is often you see things in the modern press that give you ideas for those. This is a story about a time capsule that they found from the Civil War era. And so those little things give your book some authenticity and some reality that are actually happening today, and you can use for inspiration to write your books. My third one, which we're talking about right now, is called Need to Know. So I mentioned earlier, one of the other things that I'm interested in or concerned about are things like invasion. What would that mean? And what would that, how would the world respond to that? And so my third book is about a potential invasion. Does anyone know where the world's first UFO sighting was? You want to take a guess? Any guess?
Is it in New Mexico?
New Mexico is what a lot of people say. Anyone else? It was actually at Mount Rainier in 1947. A pilot by the name of Kenneth Arnold, which is the start of my book. One of the things I like to do too is take something that actually happened and put those into my books to give kind of the jumping off point, to give it some authenticity. He witnessed what he said at the time were 9 silver discs that were coming from Canada, flying across across Washington, past Mount Rainier, and then zipped off to the south. He coined the term flying saucer when he saw those, and then when he landed, it got this huge press release and press story. And so one of the things I had in my book, or my idea was, well, what if one of those things actually crashed on Mount Rainier? What would that be, and what could it possibly be? And so that book, and this is Kenneth Arnold right here talking about the flying saucers he'd seen in 1947. So some of these books have themes to them. So there's themes like extinction events and civil war and invasion. But the book is also trying to tell, present messages and ideas about what could possibly come from those types of events. How could we rally around maybe those values that we hold dear? And so in Need to Know, it's about the potential for something being buried up on Mount Rainier, but what does that actually represent, and what could it possibly provide for us? So what's next? So as I said, you get your idea for your next book. So I got halfway through this one, the idea for another book. I was thinking, I'd actually worked at Glacier Park as a park ranger, and this was the last year I got the idea. I started writing. It was during the summer when we had these massive fires. And so parks also have a number of resources in them that often can be used for things to create new products, medicine, things like that. We actually learned to replicate DNA out of bacteria that were found in Yellowstone. So some of these resources can produce magnificent things that we use today. Well, in Glacier Park, we still have a large grizzly bear population there. And grizzly bears have been known that some of their internal organs can be used to treat for Parkinson's and other diseases like that. So I was thinking, well, what if there was a genetics lab just outside the park that was working on a cure for Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, and for some reason somebody burned that genetics lab to the ground? Well, who would want to do that, and why would they want to do that? And so that's the genesis of my next book, which is called Point of Origin, and hopefully that will be out this year. I was telling Daniel, one of the things, when you're an independent book writer, one of the things you have to do, and I was telling Chris as well, is you got to cut down your costs. And so the joke I told is it's a lot of people come to me and say, it must be hard writing books. And I've said, well, no, actually it isn't. Writing books is easy. The selling of books is very difficult. That's the hard part. So in order to recover or make any money on this, I have to keep my costs really low. So I actually design my own book covers, and I work with a platform called Kindle Direct Publishing, and it's all online. I don't even have hard copies of all my books. These are print on demand. So when you order a book of mine, if you can get you get an electronic copy, you get it immediately. If you want a hard copy, they print one at a time, which is pretty unbelievable now. So it reduces waste, which I really like, and I don't have to have a whole warehouse of inventory in order to make these things work. So when I come to events like this, I do order, 10 or 20, bring them, and then leave them behind for sale. So it's an amazing time. If you've got a book and you want to get it published, anyone can do that now. Like I said, the hard part is really selling those books. So my next book will be about the same park ranger goes throughout. His name's Grayson Cole, and he's in each one of my stories, and he'll be at Glacier Park in my next book as well. It's a neat thing about park rangers is that you often in the Park Service move around a lot like being in the military. So it's not atypical or untypical for a ranger to be at different parks, and so that works well for my main protagonist to be able to go from, say, Yellowstone to Gettysburg to Mount Rainier to Glacier National Park. So it really does make it for an interesting character. So what else is coming? One of the things I like about the national parks is they're almost unlimited on the stories you can tell, and the types of stories that I like to tell, which are thrillers based in national parks. And there's things coming up all the time. So one of the things that's happening in Alaska, where one of my stories might be set, is that we're seeing the rising temperatures melting the permafrost. And as that permafrost, which is a layer of frozen ice or frozen water in the ground, about 6 or 7 inches, well, that is consistent. It's usually solid all the time, but now that the temperatures are warming up, that's melting, and it's releasing things like viruses that have been dormant for tens of thousands of years. What's that going to mean? Are we as humans now resistant to those viruses? We don't know. Would someone want to release those viruses? So one of my books, I think, will be set up there and talk about that potential. Another one of my stories, so the first one, Unleashing Coulter's Hell, was about this extinction event, getting Yellowstone to erupt. Well, I also read on, or watched a show on mega tsunamis. This is the type of stuff that keeps me up at night. There's an island, I guess, off the coast of Spain that has a giant hillside that's slowly kind of sloughing down into the Atlantic. And if you want to really keep yourself up at night, there's Google mega tsunamis, and there's a place where they believe that if this hillside were to drop away, it could cause a wave that could wipe out the entire eastern seaboard. So again, as a writer, I'm like, I wonder if someone could get that to actually happen. What would happen? You know, how would we prevent that? So things like that I tend to think about for my books. As I was telling Daniel, from initiation of the idea to actually finish book is about 12 to 18 months. It takes, and if I had full time, I could probably write this in about 6 months. But because I have a full-time job, I work for the Department of Ecology here in Lacey. I only have a little bit of time. It's usually at lunch. So if I can get 200 to 300 words written a day, if you do that consistently for a year, you're going to be close. An average book is about 75,000 words, if not more. So you can do the math. It takes a little bit of time to get just consistent discipline to sit down and write books. So it takes a little bit of time to do that. So I went a little bit quickly, but I thought maybe I would read a little bit of my start of my first book, and then if you have any questions, I can definitely answer those for you. And maybe I'll tell a couple stories about when I was in the Park Service. And my dad always liked me to ask or tell a story about the time I had a gentleman come up with his dog, so I can tell you about that. But let me just read the beginning of my first book, or my third book, and we'll go to questions then. So I've got a little start here, a couple quotes. It says, "It's easier to fool people than to convince them they have been fooled," and that's by Mark Twain. And then another one, it goes, "I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world." And that was Ronald Reagan in a speech to President Mikhail Gorbachev in 1988. And so the theme of this book is, what would that outside threat possibly represent, and what would it mean for us? So I'll just read a couple of lines here, then we'll go. So this is the prologue to my book, and like I said, I like to take real events that have happened and then weave a story from there. So it says, airspace outside of Mount Rainier National Park, June 24th, 1947. So Kenneth Arnold was a 32-year-old founder of the Great Western Fire Control Company. Born in Minnesota, he grew up in western Montana and was the chief executive of the fire suppression business. This job required frequent travel, including many trips throughout the Pacific Northwest. Arnold decided that getting his pilot's license would ease the stress of travel. He bought one of the 16 Model A2 aircraft built by Cal Air for civilian flight. The A2 was a low-wing, two-seater aircraft. It had a single Avico Lamcoming O290A engine. This is Orlando. Creating about 125 horsepower. That horsepower produced a top speed of 140 miles per hour, and a range of approximately 350 miles. Its operating ceiling was just under 16,000 feet. That ceiling wouldn't matter today, as Arnold piloted his plane from Chehalis, Washington to Yakima. He departed Chehalis at about 2:15 p.m. and was over the tiny western Washington mining town of Mineral about 45 minutes later. The day was exceptionally clear, with more than 150 miles of visibility in every direction. The towering 14,410 foot snow-capped Mount Rainier was off to his left. Mount St. Helens, the Fuji-like young volcano, was off to his right shoulder, and the equally impressive and broad Mount Adams was ahead and to his right. Way off in the distance, on his left, was Mount Baker, which sat astride the United States-Canadian border. The mountains reminded Arnold of giant scoops of ice cream, as if some supergiant had walked from Oregon to Canada, dropping enormous sundaes every 50 miles or so. He thought it was truly beautiful. Arnold banked his plane slightly to the left until his compass read 45 degrees. The change in course would add a few extra minutes to his flight to the farming community of Yakima, but the extra time was worth it. The Army was offering a $5,000 reward to anyone who located the wreckage of a U.S. Marine Corps C-46 transport that had crashed on the slopes of Mount Rainier 6 months before. The Marine transport plane had been one of 6 planes headed from San Diego to Seattle, ferrying more than 200 Marines. The pilots were flying on instrument at roughly 9,000 feet. The weather was bad that December day, forcing 4 of the planes to turn back. 2 pushed on, one making it eventually to Seattle. The other was blown badly off course and never made it to its final destination. The military believes the plane flew into the Tahoma Glacier on Mount Rainier's western slope. A military search had failed to locate the plane, thus the reward. Arnold slowed his airspeed slightly by pulling back on the throttle. If he was to spot the wreckage, speed wasn't necessary. He needed to maximize his time over the suspected crash site. The Tahoma Glacier was a massive river of slow-moving ice. It covered nearly a quarter of the volcano's west side. It was an enormous area to search. No wonder the military hadn't found the down plane, Arnold thought, as he began a scan of the winter wonderland below. He'd only been searching for about 15 minutes, but began to think the effort was fruitless. But on the off chance that he would spot something, he pushed on. A few more minutes of searching, and Arnold concluded it was hopeless. He began a slow right turn back to his original course when a bright flashing light off to the left caught his eye. What the hell? Arnold said aloud. The flashing light reminded him of sunbeams bouncing off a mirror. Odd, he thought. He ended his turn and brought his wings to level flight in order to get a better view. Prior to leaving Chehalis, Arnold had filed a flight plan before takeoff and had been told by air traffic control that the skies would be nearly empty on this trip. A few planes that he was alerted to would be coming from the south, not the north. Yet there was the flashing object. On second look, objects. 1, 2, 3, Arnold counted to himself. On closer inspection, he concluded there were 9, maybe 10 distinct objects closing from the north. It was hard to tell. The flashing made it hard to count, but he finally settled on 9. Those have to be reflections, Arnold concluded. The sun is playing tricks on me. He took off his sunglasses. Perhaps they were causing the effect. Nope, the lights were still there. Maybe the plane's windows were at fault. The pilot rolled his plane back and forth, but the objects remained in their current position. The plane's movement had no impact on the flashing lights. No, the flashing lights were coming, and were real objects. What's going on? Arnold could see that the craft were going to pass directly in front of him, so he pushed his throttle forward. The engine revved, increasing its RPMs and airspeed. Perhaps I can get a close enough look to see what these craft are. Arnold continued to track the lights. Yes, there were clearly 9 distinct objects. They flew almost a straight line. Birds wouldn't do that. A new type of plane, perhaps? My, they are really moving fast. Arnold checked his watch. He'd first seen the lights over Mount Baker just 5 minutes and 17 seconds before. Now they were racing in front of Mount Rainier. That's more than 150 miles in a little more than 300 seconds. He did a quick calculation in his head and came to the startling speed of 1,700 miles per hour. That can't be right. America doesn't have anything that can move that fast. Arnold had read World War II reports on the America's capture of Nazi technology, including jet airplanes. But everything he read indicated these planes could reach 650 miles per hour at best. These craft were obviously going nearly 3 times that speed. Arnold pushed his craft to its maximum. He wanted to get closer. The flashing objects were passing right in front of him now. Arnold could easily make out their shape now. They were dark incredibly thin crescent-shaped objects. When viewed from the side, they seemed to disappear. The objects broke formation and began erratically flying around Mount Rainier's central peak. The jerking flight path reminded Arnold of the movement of a startled cat. First in one position, then another, then still another. That's impossible, but there it was. The objects were jumping all over the place. It appeared as if they were looking for something on the mountain, just as he was. This can't be happening, he thought. But like Arnold, the objects eventually gave up their search and reformed a straight line formation and headed at supersonic speed toward Mount Adams, some 50 miles to the southeast. Arnold watched them pass the second volcano and disappear from view. He pulled back on the throttle, slowing his craft to its normal cruising speed. He checked his watch again. I must be going crazy, he considered. The entire episode had lasted less than 7 minutes. So that's the beginning of my book. And obviously it jumps to the current day when my central character is now the superintendent at Mount Rainier. So these are my websites. I have obviously a blog. I have a Facebook page called Park Thrillers. I have a Twitter account at Park Thrillers as well. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those.